Andrea there. Um, my guess is that this evening is going to be a little bit more presentation than most of my classes. Usually I'm facilitating a pretty active dialogue, letting other folks kind of weigh in. Um, and there will be plenty of opportunity. Don't worry. If you came to hear your own voice, you will not be disappointed. But I do have a lot of material that I want to get across to you, and the nature of this is to make sure that you leave with what you were hoping to have. And so the class is broken up into three sections. Uh, Tonight, it was supposed to be next Thursday. However, we decided to add a trek to Nepal onto the calendar, so had to move the middle section to the back end. So there'll be a break in between. I think only the one week. I'm hearing someone ringing the front doorbell. Probably someone will answer it. Um, I am going to tell you a little bit about how I plan to approach this. And then I'm going to ask a question before I dive in. In thinking about how to do a crash course in death and dying from Judaism's point of view in 3 sessions, I decided to do it this way. To have the first session tonight focus on some of what Judaism has to say about death, the perspectives on it, some technicalities, and some of the elements I know you've heard about and may have some knowledge about, but may also have some misinformation on. Second session, we're going to be focusing on the mechanics of Judaism's traditions and the support systems, the rituals, and I will give a lot of caveats along the way. There'll be a lot of times that I say that there are, hey guys, that there are multiple ways of seeing this particular issue. That'll happen over and over again. And knowing me, you'll understand that it's because I'm not prescribing any particular way of thinking when it comes to any of these details. And then the third session, I think, is going to be more almost tachlis. On my outline right now, it says what to do now. And so it'll be more thinking about this next section of your life from here until your last breath. And you can choose to apply that to somebody else if you, well, no, it's coming. Don't worry. I assure you. But God willing, not for many, many years. But we'll talk about some of the ways to think about how to get there with grace and in style. Okay, so that's how I plan to lay out the 3 sessions. Now, before I dive into this first session, my request right now is for you to answer or think about and answer later. What is it that you would feel disappointed not hearing at the end of the 3 sessions? I want to make sure that over the course of the time together, my assumptions about why you're here are in line with your assumptions about what it was I was going to be doing with your time. So let me just kind of throw that out there. Does anybody have specific topics, details, or questions that they want to make sure get discussed at some point in the sessions? And I'm kind of looking over my shoulder to see who's here. Hey, Jane. So I won't, if you're online, just unmute and you can start speaking if I don't see you raising your hand. Yes, Barbara. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you. Carolyn. Oh, sorry. For people at home, Barbara said how to reduce the fear and anxiety about dying or your spouse's death, but death in general. That's great. Thank you. Carolyn?
Statistically, there will be a time when I will be and that's period process. And if you hear this about the process, and, well, I'll get through it.
Okay. Carolyn imagines a time when she is alone and dies, and she is curious about that process of dying. Lovely. Hold on one second, Jennifer. I saw a hand over here. Ellen, was that you?
Said, and just that I think this conversation gets saved for a lot of people until later in life, and I'm just looking for ways to normalize that discussion, you know, for everyone, normalize how to, how to really normalize the topic of that.
That's great. Ellen says that we often wait too long to have the conversations about death and to think about the ways of normalizing it so that we don't miss the opportunity. I'm putting words in your mouth a little bit, but how to bring our familiarity and comfort with the topic a little bit closer. Hold on one second, Stu. Oh man, this is great. Jennifer. Mazel tov. She's gonna be 50 in 2 weeks. Okay.
Like looking not ahead, but back.
Yep. Okay. I am really glad that we're doing this because as you heard in the way that I approached the 3 sessions, I wasn't really covering any of this. This is fabulous. This is so helpful. Stu, Diane, Amy. Oh, I don't care about it. If they're not in the room, it doesn't. Stu, go ahead. As someone that survived another's loss, or as an individual who is headed towards their own death? Okay, so Stu wants to hear about the steps. Yep. Diane?
Cremation versus burial versus I want to donate my body.
Good. We're covering all of that tonight. Excellent. Amy, then Mark, and Sherry, you're just going to have to wait.
Conversation, but also figuring out how to have some of these challenging conversations with others.
Yeah. So Amy's thinking about how difficult it can be to broach the topic of death with parents or anyone who's tough like that. All right, Mark, why don't you wait a minute? I'm going to go over to Sherry.
Thank you. So I think there's a lot of things that you talked about that I would agree with. I would add into that the traditions, honoring the traditions, making sure I'm aware of the traditions, especially as my parents age, and then making sure that I can explain them and speak with my kids and other family members about them to be more well-versed so that I can honor their wishes.
Terrific. That is the primary focus of the second session. And I will have some resources as well so that you don't have to remember everything I say. Thanks, Sherry. Mark? Okay. Mark said that Sherry said much better than he could what he wanted as well. They'll never know the difference. Come on. I can tell them when you said whatever I want. All right. That was really, really helpful. It not just for my relationship to this course, but also just in my relationship as a rabbi to what might be just a lot of common thoughts out there. Obviously, not where I initially thought to go. I'm really glad I asked. The ability to add to that list, it remains open. So we'll make sure we go there. Okay, we're going to start. I always forget to put the slide up for a blessing over Torah, but we're here to learn. We're learning about ourselves. We're learning about our tradition. We're learning about others' ideas, and we will assimilate some into our own, and we will leave others behind, but it'll all be engagement with learning. And so if you know the blessing, join me. I'll try to remember to have the blessing on the screen for next session. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is God who gives us the ability to learn and to engage and to exit changed. Okay, now I really can't see the faces at home. And so if you've got anything you want to add, you really will just have to unmute and jump in. But I want to start by thinking about how does a tradition come to its decisions, its standpoints, its detail work on anything, and in our case, death and dying. And our tradition, so many others, is built on now millennia of opinions. It all starts from some place, some concept that is shared communally, culturally, and then begins to find its way into some codification and being written down. And then along the way, it evolves. So as our ancient ancestors began to think about how they were different from their surrounding tribes, we don't sacrifice our children. We don't worship these pagan gods. We don't do this. We don't do that. Well, what do we do? And what do we think? So a comment starts to coalesce. It gets written down at some point, and then along the way, it gets enhanced, it gets discussed, it gets refined. And as history progresses and outside influences have their mark on us, we find ourselves feeling increasingly different. So the way that you think about death today is almost certainly different than the way anybody thought about death 3,000 years ago at the beginning of our origin story. And I can't even emphasize that sufficiently. So you'll just have to trust me. But what I want to start with is a concept that we find all throughout Judaism, and that is the sanctity of life. We start early on in Genesis with the notion that God creates everything, that humans are created b'tselem Elohim, with the Ruach HaChaim, with the breath of life in the image of God. And so early on, we have this notion that we are special. And depending on how you want to interpret the texts through history, that specialness remains, but starts to include everything else. As a non-dualist, I don't think that I am more special than a rose, but we're all manifestations of God. However you decide to go that theological route, what remains constant is the notion that this matters. And we do whatever we can to protect it, to preserve it, to respect it. And so I'm going to show a text. Did that work? Yeah. This comes much later. This is from the Talmud, from the Mishnah. When there's a little M in front of the name of a tractate, that means it's from the Mishnah. And when you start to put the Mishnah and the commentary together, that's Talmud. And I always remind people all this stuff because we forget. So Mishnah was codified in the year 200 by a guy, now that I think about it, who we're going to hear from later and hear about later. But in the Mishnah, this really common statement shows up for the first time. Anyone who sustains one soul, forget about it saying from the Jewish people. That's context. But anyone who saves one life, it's as if he saved the entire world. That's how we usually see it. This is a little bit expanded translation. It also has the other side of it, which says anyone who destroys one life, it's as if he destroyed the whole world. And the teaching comes from the idea that the whole world of people came from one life, Adam. And so every time you remove someone from the gene pool, you're taking away untold myriads of souls. I only put it up here because it further deepens the idea that we hold life sacred. And that's going to have to be just a a constant in your awareness as we start talking about death. If we hold life so constant, sacred, it's obviously going to affect how we feel about death. There's a tradition I heard about from the Far East. I don't know if it's accurate, but there was a culture I heard about where when an elder reached the point that they could no longer contribute to the collective, they would go out to the hillside overlooking the river, and they would sit there until they passed out of hunger, and then their body would roll down the hill into the river and wash away. That's not a Jewish approach. We don't say if this person can no longer contribute, then they are of no value to us and they're just taking up resources. There are some people I know who are just taking up resources, but that's neither here nor there. So we have this notion that whatever we can do to save life, we should do. And so one of the first, maybe this meanders a little bit, but one of the first concepts I'm going to just remind us, oh, that's not what I wanted to show you. Okay, I'll come back to what I wanted to show you. All right, I'm going to go back up here for a second. I have a slide at some point in my deck about organ donation. And there are not Bubamysas, there's folk wisdom that is passed along the way and sometimes not exactly right. So we're going to talk a lot in a few moments about the sanctity of the body. And because of that theme, it's not uncommon people say, well, you have to be buried whole. Otherwise, well, they don't know why all the time. We'll see if you do. And because of that, people sometimes worry about organ donation. So can you, if you are taken before your time and your organs are still good, can you let a doctor take away your pieces and be buried without them? And the answer is a resounding absolutely you can. Absolutely. That's not a reform point of view. It is across the board. All but the most fringe elements of the ultra-Orthodox world believe that organ donation is a mitzvah, and if it's something that you can imagine, you should register as an organ donor. Now, staying in the same notion of what we can do with our bodies, there's a question that sometimes arises about donating your body to science. And now that we have the technology, the ability to transfer organs more readily, there's more comfort. In the early days, when it was very likely that the recipient wouldn't accept the organ and would die anyway, rabbis were mixed about whether it was appropriate to remove an organ from the body with such a low likelihood of saving someone. Once the rate of success increased, they said, no, we should do this. When you get to the question of donating your body, there are different opinions. Some say that the distance between the one who gives his body and the people down the road who may someday be saved by advances in science is too great. And so let others donate their bodies. Jews should get buried. But that's not an overwhelming opinion. There are plenty of opinions. Now, these are more liberal opinions that say, hey, you're here thanks to advances in science. And if it's something that feels right to you, you should feel readily empowered to donate your body. Sometimes you can request that the body be returned for burial when the science has been accomplished. And that might be another option. But I just want you to know that those kinds of things get talked about along the way. Yeah, Amy.
Science, because in Jewish tradition, it's considered more valuable to save a life or help someone else than to follow whatever the.
Yeah. So Amy asked, is it permissible because the value of saving a life, which in Hebrew is pikuach nefesh, the protection of a soul, is that value higher than the values that we're about to talk about? And the answer is yes, that's exactly right. There are preferences towards what I'm about to talk about, but saving a life, if you can, no question, you should absolutely do that. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about this body and the cultural relationship to the idea of a body. Psychologically, you might ask the question, what is one's soul? What is that? I asked a teen last week, and he was saying, well, it's what makes me different from you. It's what I think of as me. And that's lovely. Others might call that a psyche or a sense of self or an ego. And that's all correct. Soul is sometimes thought of differently. Not always. I don't think of it differently. I think of soul as the life energy. And sometimes it's aware and sometimes we're not aware of it. But either way, our tradition, I always think of this scene. How many of you saw the movie Men in Black? Do you remember this? There was a great little scene where one of the aliens who's walking around Earth as disguised as a human is dying. And just before he dies, the body that he's been using to carry him around, he's a little tiny thing. It like the head opens up like a box, and this little tiny alien is sitting inside the head of this machine. He's got all these controls. He's been walking around talking into a microphone, and he's around us just existing in this body. The body is a container for him. And I often think back to that analogy when we talk about the way the body and the soul are related. And so it's not uncommon for people to think of the body as a carrying case, that in utero, this is from Midrash and from mysticism, in utero, the angels assign a soul to a body. And the soul and the body remain united over the course of that body's life. And when the body comes to its end, stops functioning as a machine, the soul disconnects, returns to the collective, and the body is left behind. That's conceptually how Judaism typically talks about the soul. Now, and by the way, I don't know that I believe that. That's not how I think about it, but this isn't Jay's Theology 101. So if we think about the body as a container, we have another concept to add to that, and that is that it is on loan. God, again, this is now traditional theology, God gives the soul use of this body for a period of time. And there's a notion, you've heard this before, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Here I have, here, right there, I got it. For dust you are. This is from the second chapter, maybe the first chapter of Genesis, where God takes clay from the four corners of the earth and forms it into a human likeness and then breathes into it the breath of life. So that notion that we start from clay or from dirt, from soil, from material of the earth is where we get here. From dust you are. And the name for human in Hebrew is Adam. The name for earth is Adamah. They're the same word. So human and earth are the same, which I love. Even before they understood carbon and in decomposition and returning to earth, I love that. So if we started out as dust, our end is to return to dust. Now, that is used as a proof text. The rabbis could have come up with anything they want. I could probably go back to the Torah myself in 10 minutes and find you a text somewhere that could argue for the point that all Jews should hurl themselves off of skyscrapers before they, as their way of death. There are all kinds of ways to justify your agenda with text. There's often there's a saying, where there is a will, there is a halachic way. Halacha is the Jewish law. And so what they're saying in that, with a little bit of cynicism or whatever, is that the rabbis will find what they want the text to say. So for whatever reason, they chose this verse as a proof text for why we should honor the body. This gets us to the question of cremation. Okay. So you could argue convincingly that when you burn up the body, it returns to dust. That's true. But the counter argument is, and I love thinking about this. You ready for it? It's not yours to burn up. You know, imagine if your buddy said, "Hey, listen, I got this really important task. I need to borrow your car." And you said, "Yeah, of course, you can borrow my car." And he comes back 2 weeks later and knocks on your front door and says, "Yeah, I brought your car back." And you look out behind him, and at the curb is this smoldering pile of ash, right? Still steaming. You'd be furious. It wasn't his to burn up. And so similarly, the tradition says the body isn't yours to do with as you see fit. By the way, and we'll talk more about this as well, this is the same notion around what the Torah says is marking and gashing your body. So that's where they get from there to tattoos and other piercings. There are a few piercings that are permitted, but the rest are considered desecration of something that's not yours to mess around with. You know, if you were a guest in someone's home and while you were there, you decided you were going to paint a mural on their wall, you would understand their frustration. It wasn't yours to paint. And so these are the notions behind honoring the body. Now, those are traditional. What I want to say is that when I was a young rabbi, a new rabbi in Denver, I was sitting with a young woman. She was probably 40, I'm guessing. And she was losing a battle to breast cancer. She was close to the end. And she had been ravaged by breast cancer her entire adult life. You know, for 20 years, it was miserable. She never got any part of the life that she imagined she would have, and she was bitter. And she said to me, "Rabbi, I'm going to cremate myself I'm going to have myself cremated because I hate this fucking body." And I knew enough to keep my mouth shut and to not say to her, "Well, you know, that's really not our tradition." It was not my place. It was not the time. And if you come to me and say, "I'm planning on cremation," I'm going to say, "Great, let's talk about what that looks like." I'm not going to try and talk someone out of it. That's not my job. Other rabbis would disagree and see it as their job, but I'm your travel partner. And so if you've already got notions about what you're looking for, I'll go there with you. There are some other arguments that turn some people off from cremation. The primary one typically is referencing the Holocaust. That I've heard people say, "I could never cremate myself because it feels like giving Hitler the final win. You know, he wanted to burn us up in the crematoria. I don't want to give that to him." I totally understand that, and I totally understand why others see it differently. I've heard arguments in favor of it based on cost, and it is a little bit less expensive than the traditional burial process. Some say that it's an environmentally better choice. I'm not sure that bears out in the science because the carbon footprint of the incineration is quite high. Others say, "I don't want a piece of real estate for eternity. What do I need that for?" I get all the arguments. They're all just, they're all logical. And so if you're looking for judgment, I do know a few other rabbis I could send you to. Along the same lines, the questions that sometimes are asked are, if I get cremated, can I be buried in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery? And the answer is a resounding, it depends. It depends on the cemetery. There are cemeteries that have bylaws, basically, statutes that do not permit that. If your plot is in one of those cemeteries and this is your plan, here's what I would do. I would tell your survivors to hide your ashes in the pocket of someone who dies after you, and then there you go. You got buried in a Jewish cemetery. At Temple Sinai's cemetery, I've interred cremains many times. And it often gives people a lot of comfort. The first in a partnership to pass, knowing that that their cremains are going to remain until they can be buried at the same time with their partner. I love that. That's great. And so we do that very comfortably. Along the same lines, two other topics are embalming. Embalming is a way of removing elements of the body and putting in other elements for the sake of avoiding this. And traditionally, we don't do that. There are times when embalming is necessary. If you're transporting a body long distances, there are situations where it's required, where the airlines, or I don't know whose law it is actually, they require it. And so, if that's your goal, okay, we'll talk about being buried in Israel in a moment. That could be an example. And the final one item on this matter would be autopsies. Autopsies can be very traumatic for survivors to know, especially if you have in your kishka this sense of sanctity of the body and our traditions around not desecrating. I remember, I don't even know if it's true, but I remember hearing that my great-grandfather, whose tallis I wear on Yom Kippur, that at the end of his life, he needed to have his lower leg amputated. And I'd heard that they buried his leg in the plot that he would someday be buried in so that his body would be all together. And I'll show you why in just a minute. And so autopsies can leave people feeling uncomfortable. There are times when, for religious reasons, you can make a case and sometimes win that you would not wish an autopsy. And there are other times when it's absolutely mandated and there's no way around it. In Colorado, anybody who died at home, if they were not on hospice, an autopsy was required. So you could be 107 years old and die at home peacefully in your sleep, and they do an autopsy on you to find the cause of death. I know the cause of death. I was 107 years old. Okay, so let me pause and see if anyone wants to ask questions or share thoughts on any of the stuff we've covered so far. Ellen. No, I don't know the Connecticut laws. I've been connected with a couple of situations that were outside the ordinary, and autopsies were done. A couple of suicides and a couple of strange deaths that wouldn't have been expected. And I don't know if those were required by law or if that was the medical examiner convincing the family. I don't know. Yeah, but they're usually in sort of extenuating circumstances.
Rabbi,
right. Yeah.
It's Leslie. October 7, the rave, and at other places, there were people who were murdered and their bodies were dismembered. What's the thinking about burial there?
Yeah. Thanks, Leslie. There's an organization in Israel called Zakah, which shouldn't have to exist. And yet they've got lots of practice entering places in which bodies have been destroyed. And their goal is to collect every bit of human material as possible. So in suicide bombings where a pizza parlor is utterly destroyed, or a bus, and there's no way to rejoin bodies together, after the coroner comes and collects pieces and they try to put them back together so that they can be buried as complete as possible. After that, Zakah comes in, and in all the news stories following a pigua in Israel, you'll see these men in full body coverages, and they're combing the pavement for anything that should not be left out and unattended to. So that's probably what was happening in Israel that day and the following days.
What happens when they can't find all the pieces?
Yeah, well, that's so. Carol was relating a story that she heard a family who buried a tooth. So what Leslie is asking is, are you asking if they can't find all the pieces or if they can't find any pieces?
Well, take either one.
Yeah. If you can't find all the pieces, you do the best you can. You know, we're a pragmatic people and we've always done the best we can. If you can't find any pieces, that's a little bit more complicated because then you're dealing with the legal question of, are they actually dead? If you don't have confirmation of that. And that's a really unpleasant place for everybody. Okay. Thanks. Let's oh yeah, Tamara, what have you got?
When I've been to funerals, they usually have the coffin in the room, during the service. If someone is cremated, do they just put the urn or whatever they're putting the ashes in, like inside a coffin, and then still bring a coffin into the service? And then that coffin with the ashes, inside of it is put in the ground, or do you just bring an urn in, or how does that work?
Yeah, great questions. I've never seen it placed, the cremains placed in a coffin, but if you wanted that, there'd be no reason not to. Typically they come back in I've seen an urn maybe once or twice. Usually it's in just a nice box, just a nice wooden box. And I have definitely officiated services where the cremains are with us in the sanctuary, but more often than not, it takes more time than you would think to get that process complete. And in that, it's our tradition to have a funeral as quickly as is reasonable. It's usually the case in my limited experience, the person hasn't been cremated yet. And so we're holding a funeral while they await the completion of that process. I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to move on. Yep.
And during the funeral, the coffin with no remains was in, and then they took it to the crematorium.
So Carol, yes, thank you. I don't remember if I've had that experience or not, but Carol's remembering a service where somebody who was going to be cremated was placed in a coffin, the coffin brought to the chapel wherever the service was happening, and then after the service was then cremated in the coffin. Okay. I'm just checking. Oh God, man, you'd think this many years into teaching, I would have a better sense of how much I could cover in the amount of time that I have. Let's talk for a few moments about the concept Judaism holds around the dead body itself. Anybody in the room a Kohen? Kohanim? Judaism has a caste system. Did you know that? There are 3 caste levels in Judaism. There's Yisrael, and that's almost all of us. And then there's the Levites, and then the Kohens. And in today's world, there's almost nothing remaining of the material difference. In traditional services, there's a role that the Kohanim play in sending out a blessing. And the Levites are a part of that mechanism. But other than that, and when there's a Torah service, Kohanim get the first aliyah, and the Levites get the second aliyah, and then all the rest are for us. Kohen is, it's a religious leader. And I've heard, though I've never seen confirmation of this, that it's the same etymology as the word kahuna, from like you think of like the big kahuna surfing the waves, the top dog in a sense. The Kohen was the one who was responsible for the ritualization or the relationship between God and the Israelites through ritual sacrifice. So the Israelites needed to bring a sacrifice. They'd bring it to the temple. They'd hand it to the Levites. The Levites would take it over to the Kohens. The Kohens would slaughter the animal. And then there's all different kinds of handling of the animal at that point. But the Kohens' purity needed to be really carefully guarded. They couldn't engage in these really important rituals if they were impure. And one of the many ways of contracting impurity is by touching a corpse or being in proximity to a corpse. And so there is still a standing tradition that Kohanim don't come to funerals and don't go to cemeteries. Sometimes that is adjusted for the loss of their own parents. but not always. And the irony is that even with that stricture, there is no way for the Kohen to perform his ritual duty in this world. We don't do sacrifices. And even if there was that opportunity, the only way to wash away that purity is with the ritual of the red heifer. I know we're getting into the minutia of Judaism now. Some of you are thinking, he's pulling our leg. And I know I often do, but in this case, I'm not. The red heifer, which we haven't found in 2,000 years. We almost had one in like 1989, but the rabbis found a mark on its lip and decided it wasn't kosher enough. You burn up the red heifer, the ashes are mixed with water, and the priest goes through ablutions using that to purify himself. But out of an abundance of caution, it's common for Kohanim to stay away from the cemetery and things having to do with death. And that's why, by the way, when you leave a Jewish cemetery, you'll often find at the exit a washing station. Or in most cases today, if you get to the Shiva house, you'll find a washing station, often on the front porch, and you're invited to wash your hands because you're symbolically doing the purification, washing off the tameh, the impurity of death. But psychologically, it works nicely too. It's about leaving behind that space of the dead and re-entering the world of the living. Diane?
Until you said E, I guess there were no D.
Correct. Yeah. So Diane's asking about the notion of Kohen, and number one, yes, it is completely connected to the name Cohen, and you will rarely find a man named Cohen who's not a Kohen. It does happen, and I don't know how, but it's passed patrilineally. Also, Kahana or Katz or Khan, they're very often Kohanim. Same thing with families whose name are Levi or I can't think of any others at the moment. But these are absolutely patrilineally descended Kohanim. And it gets cooler. As genetic sequencing has really come into a more understandable concept, they have 100% traced every Kohen genetically back to a single male ancestor. And that man, by the way, would have been Aaron. So at the revelation of Torah to the world, we have the two brothers, and yes, there are no female Kohanim. You're thinking ahead of your time. We have Aaron and his brother, and Moses is given the role of prophet, and Aaron is given the role of priest. And later on, we introduce the role of king. And so you have these three, it's sort of a tripartite form of government, really. Each one responsible for its own element of the culture, but the priest, the prophet, and the king all coexist through some of Jewish history. Good question. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure,
Have
go
I?
ahead, Jane.
Okay, so I'm descended from a Kaplan who's a Kohen, and I'm also a Levi. So my father was a Levi. But I have a question about this because I know what the Kohens do, having done it through tradition in our family. But what is the premise when my older sister passed away and Kara was pregnant? They would not let Kara go to the cemetery.
Yeah, it's not because of the Kohen Levi elements in your family. I am sorry to say this, but when you married Bud, you lost all privilege as a Kohen or a Levite. It goes through the patriarchy, the male bloodline. So Kara, unless he's a Kohen or a Levite, Kara is just Yisrael, like the rest of us.
He's an Israelite.
The reason she was probably prohibited from going to the cemetery is a bogomisa, a superstition that that you don't want to, you don't want to tempt the evil eye. You don't want the pregnancy to be corrupted by Lilith or other demons that fly around, jinns or golems or whatnot. We have a lot of that stuff in our sort of medieval era of teaching.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I want to move now into some other direction. We're going to talk first about the idea of the moment of death, and this is not going to answer Carolyn's question. It's in the realm, and then we're going to talk about afterlife. Remember, this evening is more about Jewish concepts and how we relate to the idea of death. Jennifer? Yeah.
Casket.
Traditionally, yeah. Good question. So Jennifer wonders why we do closed caskets usually. And that is primarily because our tradition is that, and we'll talk about this next session, there are processes that are initiated to prepare the body for burial. A ritual washing, dressing in a traditional shroud. And then once that process has been completed, the body is prepared. And to open the casket and expose it to the rest of the world sets that preparation back. That's one piece of it. The second piece is that, and this is lovely. We'll talk about this as well next week. Yeah, next week. There is this notion that chesed shel emet, which is altruistic generosity, can really almost only be exhibited by caring for the dead. Because every other time when we're interacting with a human, maybe we're doing something that appears really generous and there's an ulterior motive in the back of our head. But once someone's dead, they can't do anything else for us. And so anything we do for them is true generosity. So you are all wearing clothing tonight because you're modest. You can take care of that modesty yourself. But once you're dead, you can't control your own exposure. And so out of a sense of respect for that person who can no longer cover themselves, might not want to be looked at, we refrain from opening the casket just to offer them that. Yeah, Carolyn.
Children and grandchildren and spouses were asked to do that. And they're all in there. And they just this part of the cast, it was really beautiful with the cast. And
Carolyn's remembering the funeral of her mother, you said? Mother-in-law, when they were invited to come look at the body in the casket. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, that was the burial shroud. Although probably Carolyn remembers that her mother-in-law's body was wrapped with only the face showing, and probably after that viewing, the hood was pulled down over her face gently and then closed. Traditionally, that's not done. That there are a lot of traditions in our history and in our recent past that we have absorbed from our surrounding, cultures. And we were talking about the wake before the class got started. That was pragmatic. That was, I want to get a look at the dead person and really make sure they're dead. And psychologically, there's some wisdom in that. It does force. Yeah. Well, Jews do it differently. So to confront without denial the loss of our loved ones, we do it through Shiva. It's the same notion of not allowing someone to just ignore the fact that something significant has happened for them. One more comment? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what percentage of everybody in our family is, they've been buried with clothing, like, oh, what would we,
Yeah.
more so now that people do the ground.
No, no. When someone in our community dies, or the loved one of one of our community members, usually is when I'm having the conversation, and I'm talking with the survivor about the choices that are going to be offered. I describe to them what this is, and again, we'll go over in more detail next session. But no, I would say that in our community, in our progressive community, 1 out of every 15 or more chooses these traditional elements. Yeah, no, you're not unusual. Which is my way of saying you're not that special. Okay, so there's a debate in Judaism about what is the moment of death, and this has some relevance because it will inform other decisions that we'll be making along the way. And I'm going to lay out 2 basic approaches. One is the approach of sort of the conservative world, although not definitively, and that is that the moment of death happens when there's no more brain activity, there's no hope of recovery, there's no future there. That's when a person dies. The other point of view is when the heart is no longer beating. And those 2 approaches will weigh heavily on a set of decisions that come out of that. You know, if somebody is viewed as still alive, even though they're nothing more than a body, and you turn off the respirator, others might say that's murder. You know, the significance there is significant. Can we just pretend that didn't happen? I'll edit that out later. So I guess I think I'm going to jump ahead and talk about some of the end of life kinds of questions. I'm going to have to skip over a couple of slides here to get us there. There it is. Okay, so here's a classic story from the Talmud. Judah is that guy I was referring to earlier. He's the one who single-handedly is credited with saving Judaism. After the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, Yochanan ben Zakkai asked the Caesar to give him Yavna and its sages. That was his language. And even though the bulk of our people were being slaughtered in Jerusalem, he knew that if we preserve our tradition through the wisdom, then we can rebuild ourselves. So the era of the rabbis really got started then. That's when Rabbinic Judaism, which we're still in today, was initiated. Over the next 150 years, really 52 years, the rabbis were in the process of discussing and elaborating and sharing. And this guy, Judah the Prince, oh, you can't see anything. This guy, he still can't see. There, no. What's going on? Okay, this guy, Rabbi Judah the Prince, was aware that the turbulence of the day meant that we were in danger of losing all of our tradition. And so, against great resistance, he codified the Mishnah. He collected all the stories that were out there, and he put them together into one collection of books. Nowadays, it's broken into 6 volumes, and who knows 6? I know 6. 6 are the something of the Mishnah, orders of the Mishnah. That's from him. So the story about his death comes in the Talmud, which was his Mishnah combined with the Gemara, and together they're the Talmud. So this is a story about the way he died. I'm going to read it. Rabbi Judah was suffering from a severe and painful stomach disease. His devoted students and colleagues decreed a public fast and offered prayers for heavenly mercy Furthermore, they announced that whoever said that Rabbi Judah was dead would be stabbed with a sword. The rabbi's handmaid, and this is someone who was really close to him, who took care of him, who probably had a very emotional love for him. She ascended to the roof of the house that he was in, and she prayed. She said, "The immortal beings in heaven desire Rabbi to join them, and the mortals desire the Rabbi to remain with them." She went on, "May it be the will of God that the mortals may overpower the immortals." So here her prayer is, God's trying to pull Judah up to heaven. We're trying to hold him back down here. Let us win. However, when she saw how often Rabbi Judah resorted to the privy, painfully taking off his tefillin and putting them on again each time, she prayed, "May it be the will of the Almighty that the immortals may overpower the mortals." So here she sees that it's cruel to keep him here. We all want him, and that's selfish. We're not thinking about his suffering. Watching all these other people incessantly continuing their prayers for heavenly mercy, she took up an earthenware jar up to the roof and threw it down to the ground. It smashed, made a loud noise, and for just a moment, they all ceased praying to find out what was that. And the soul of Rabbi Judah departed to its eternal rest. The Talmud believed that it was the prayer that was keeping him alive. And so for long enough, she distracted the prayers so that his soul could be released, and off it goes. How many of you have had the experience or heard the experience of telling someone, whispering to them in their ear, "It's okay, you can go now"? And, granted, if I said that to you tonight and you died in your sleep, that would be powerful. We often don't say this until a person is pretty close anyway, but it sure seems often effective, as if we need to know that it's okay to go. So this story is the proof text for allowing the removal of life-saving measures. Because of this, in many situations, you can turn off the respirator. You can remove nutrition and hydration when it is deemed to be crueler to keep the person alive. So I don't know why it says that at the beginning, but again, so Nedarim is another Talmud. I'm not going to bother with Talmud. I'll teach you that stuff some other time. So here this is Judah the Prince saying, there are times when one should pray for the sick to die, such as when the sick one is suffering greatly from his malady and his condition is terminal. As I was putting this together tonight, I was thinking about the horrific experience of the father who was relieved to find out that his daughter had been killed in Israel on October 7th. And then the utter devastation to find out that, in fact, she was alive and she was a captive in Israel, in Gaza. That's an example where it's crazy to even put yourself in that space. But I could understand wanting my child to be dead rather than subjected to what I imagine is going on. And so there are cases where it's okay to hear it. This is active. Remember what they believed about prayer. Prayer is effective. So here they're actively praying for death. That's significant. David, go ahead.
This support the concept of assisted suicide.
So I'm going to do one more slide and then we'll talk about that in half a second. So this is from the Shulchan Aruch. So the Talmud was the dominant text for about 1,000 years. And then in about the 1500s, there was a guy named Joseph Caro who wrote a huge compendium of all the laws. It was called the Tur, and it was absolutely unusable. So another guy named Moshe Isserlis, excuse me, in the next century or so, decided to cut away all the stuff that we didn't really need, and he put together the operative rules on how to live a Jewish life according to law. And by the way, it was cool. He took 3 opinions, one Ashkenaz, one Sephardic, and then his own. And whichever was the majority rule when there was a difference of opinions, that became the law, but he always codified the minority opinion. So that book became the Shulchan Aruch. And that has been the dominant guidance for Jewish law for observant communities till this day. Lots and lots and lots of updates along the way, but this is a definitive text. This is a big deal. So there it says, if anything which causes a hindrance to the departure of the soul, if there is anything, it is permissible to remove it from there because there's no act involved, only the removal of the impediment. So here it's saying that there's no proactive, we're getting to the assisted suicide in a moment. There's no proactive choice in killing a person by removing life support. All you're doing is taking something away. This is just giving almost some comfort to people who have awful decisions to make and saying, don't worry, you're not murdering your loved one. If you have to make that decision, you're covered by Jewish law. It's, there's quite a lot of compassion in this statement. So to get to David's question about what about physician-assisted suicide, active euthanasia, I'll say that predominantly the Jewish voices don't vote in favor of it. It's certainly not in the more traditional world. In the progressive world, I brought you a text from Peter Noble, who's alive and well. He's a fabulous teacher. He was the president of the CCAR for a short time. And he wrote, in certain cases where the pain experienced by a terminally ill patient diminishes her ability to live in the image of God. Listen to that. I mean, that's amazing. If we are so destroyed by our pain that we're not even really human, if human is an expression of the divine image, we've been diminished to something else. Our humanity has been destroyed. Euthanasia may be permitted, even praiseworthy. In cases of extreme suffering, active euthanasia is permitted when the person has waived his or her right not to be killed. Effectively, that's when the lawyers get enough documentation that this person is of sound mind. You can't do this with someone who has dementia because they can't give you permission to take their life. But if someone can waive the right saying, it's okay, I give you permission to kill me. And if it's consistent with the person's biography. So if there's mental illness and all of a sudden they want to die, that would be a concern. But Amy asks if you can write this into a living will and advanced medical directive. That's a good question. I don't expect so, but I don't know. On my original itinerary, we were going to get to advanced medical directives in the 3rd session. I'm guessing now we probably aren't gonna, but I will bring some resources on that, and I will see if I can look into the question of can you pre-write that? My guess is, I don't know. I have to think. You can obviously put in place DNR, a do not resuscitate, which is to say, don't go to heroic measures. And I believe you can write into it, if I am without chance of recovery, you can remove life support, but I don't know if you can pre-order the okay. Yeah, Barbara. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To soothe the patient.
Yeah. Barbara's wondering about the use of medications like heroic doses of morphine or something, which we know ease pain and we know hastens death. And we'll talk about hospice, where that would be the most common place to find that way of approach. We'll talk about that next session. Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Okay, you've all been waiting for the afterlife in more ways than one. So we're going to talk for a few moments about where we start with this notion and how it develops. Okay, so though our individual egos have collectively gained significance over the centuries, what I mean by that is historians argue that pre-industrialization, and increasingly the further you go back, there was less and less sense of the importance of me as an individual. In modernity and in post-modernity, we live surrounded by the world, but it's me in the world. And it's hard for me to really get my brain around what it would have been otherwise, because that's just too foreign for us. But notwithstanding what I just said, the sense that I don't want to just come to an end, I don't want it to be a light switch. I was here and now I'm not. It could be that that's what led to the development of prophecy and teaching about afterlife. Now, I'm not saying that it's a fabrication of human creativity, but what I'm saying is what real, other than revelation at Sinai, and if your relationship to that notion that God gave us knowledge, downloaded a whole playbook that day on Sinai, if that speaks to you, then that's wonderful. It doesn't speak to me. So where do humans, just like me, get any real knowledge about the afterlife other than, I don't know, do I want to say wishful thinking or creativity or I know people, plenty of people who receive signs from their ancestors, from their loved ones. We know that the Torah does not discount the effectiveness of mediums who can speak with the dead. It does say it's nothing for a nice Jewish boy, but it prohibits us from discussing with mediums and oracles the future or the dead. It does not say it doesn't work. And so Judaism has had a relationship with the concept of afterlife for a very long time. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer. Yeah. Well, so give me half a second. Yeah. So we're talking about afterlife, and Jennifer asks, does that mean there was a before life? And in the mystical teachings, yes. There are lots of imageries to draw upon, but one of them that speaks to me is the idea that either there's a place where souls spend most of eternity, with the exception of the hopefully 120 years they spend in our body. So they're there, and then they come here, and then they go back there. Not so much teaching. I've heard of it, but reincarnation is not a piece of our tradition. You don't find that much. But yes, there was a before life. I did hear a Rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, who encouraged us to worry less about life after death and to worry more about life before death, which is very much a Jewish teaching. I don't know that we'll get there tonight, but early in the books, we start hearing of two places. Well, three, I suppose. One of them goes by two names. There's Sheol and Gehinnom. And the other one is Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, or Sheol, which has to do with blackness. And Gehinnom is a place, a literal place outside Jerusalem. If you went out the Zion Gate and took a right, it's that valley down below. And in centuries before we became a thing, the worshippers of Moloch used to sacrifice their children there. and lift them up to Malach in fire. And so it became a really ugly place for us, a place of abhorrence. So Gehinom is short for Ge'e ben Hinnom, the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is like hell. I mean, it's a place that you just can't even imagine. It's so ich. And so the Jewish teachings around the continuity after we die go way back for us. But then they get developed first by us, and then the Christians take it and they really run. And we'll come back to this in half a second. But I want to show you one of the significant proof texts around the fact that death is not the end. So this is from Isaiah. And the prophets often have wild prophecy and description. Ezekiel is another one where you'll find a lot of this stuff. So I don't know if I'll read the whole thing. But here it's talking about someday on this mount, something big is going to happen. Everything's going to change. And God will put an end to the reproach of God's people over the earth, for it's God who's spoken. And then it goes on to say, the inhabitants of the world have not come to life. Let your dead revive. Let corpses arise, awake, and shout for joy, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew on fresh growth. And I think it continues. No. So a text like this is used as proof that when Messiah comes, all who have lived will live again. And God, there's so much I want to say about this. That's part of why people say, well, you have to be buried with your whole body, because when you're reincarnated, how can you walk around if your leg was amputated and not with you? But the rabbis assure us, don't worry, God can take care of that. But the idea that it's all going to happen again, and this has to do with the eschatology of Jesus, that we and Christians share prophecy about what the end of days will look like and what the outcomes of Messiah will be. There have been many false messiahs over the course of our history where a man, always a man, come on, let's be honest here, arises and convinces people that he is the Messiah, and the fervor grows to a fever pitch, and then he dies and nothing changes. And nowhere in our tradition do we see prophecy that says the Messiah needs 2 tries. A second coming of the Messiah is not our tradition. So when Jesus died and nothing changed, this didn't happen. We said, oh, damn, such a good guy. We really hoped he was the Messiah, and we moved on. Same thing, by the way, with the Lubavitchers in Brooklyn. When Menachem Mendel Schneerson died in 1994, their community was torn because there was not quite half, but a huge portion of their whole community said, no, the Rebbe didn't die. That casket that they carried over their shoulders through the streets of Brooklyn, it was empty. I had my hand on it. It was too light. He wasn't in there. He's alive. And they still believe it, that he is just going to come back. And you'll all be shown he is the Messiah. The desire not to be wrong is really, really powerful. So let's talk about why we might have the idea of not just an afterlife, but later on, a whole lot of description around the judgment. If you've got 2 places, Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, paradise, heaven, and you've got Gehinom, the ugliest, darkest, full of fire, hell. How do you know which one you're going to go to? Korach in the Torah, when he attacked Moses and undertook a coup, the ground opened up and it says he went down to Sheol alive. When Elijah was carried up to Gan Eden alive, that was because of his merit. And so we developed this system of, well, if you're good enough, you'll go here. And if you're bad, you'll go there. And that comes from something called, give me a second. Oh, I can't remember the name of the, I'll have to look it up. It's the study of and explanation of why bad things happen to good people. it's always on the tip of my tongue. I can never think of this word. So the world is a chaotic place. And the things that should happen to a good person often happen to a bad person, and vice versa. And so religion needed to develop something to explain how to make sense of this. Why should I be a good Jew if there's no guarantee that I'm going to become rich and famous and powerful and have all the things that I have ever wanted? Those rewards should come because I'm a good person, right? And since they don't, the explanation is that reward and punishment is deferred. If you want to party hardy in this life and act like a beast and earn your place in hell, the pleasure that you enjoy in this life is nothing compared to the suffering you're going to get in hell. And if you've been a good person and suffered through this world, don't worry, because the suffering you've experienced as a good person in this world is nothing compared to the privilege and pleasure, eternal pleasure that you'll enjoy in the world to come. Now, just to show you a little fun, because this is real, there is a notion that it's better if you can swing it to be buried in Jerusalem. Anyone familiar with anyone who's been flown to Israel to be buried? Yeah. It does happen. Not so much in our community, but it's not unusual that you hear someone who is flown all the way back to Jerusalem. And why? Because when Messiah comes, it'll be in Jerusalem. It'll be on a white donkey. Maybe you've seen pictures of Jesus on a white donkey. They got that part from us too. When the cataclysm or the resurrection happens, it'll start in Jerusalem, right there on the Temple Mount, right where the big gold dome is. That's where our temple was. And it will go out in circles. It'll radiate out from that spot. And so what is the closest spot in a cemetery that a Jew can be to that center? It's the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim. Yeah. Well, they're not exactly facing it, but the lower you get on the hill, the closer you are to the walls of Jerusalem. And those people will be resurrected first. So you can pay millions of dollars for a plot there. And they're buried 10 deep. It's the most unbelievable place. Any chance you have it to just go walk to the cemeteries over there, it's remarkable. And so this is from Bereshit Rabbah, which is a collection of Midrash, not Torah, not Mishnah, not Talmud, extra textual stuff, stories and legends. And it says, why the patriarchs have a fondness for the burial in the land of Israel? Because the dead of the land of Israel come to life first in the Messianic era and enjoy the Messianic years. So you might be thinking, well, man, crap, I bought a plot in Stamford, Connecticut. You know, what's going to happen to me? Don't worry. But you should understand the consequences of your choice. So here's another one from Genesis. The rabbi said, wait a second, what are you telling about all of us who are going to die outside of the land? It's okay. Those who die outside the land of Israel will not live again at the resurrection, except after, so it's okay, you're going to be resurrected, except after the pain caused by the body rolling through the underground tunnels that will show up to take you from Stamford to Jerusalem. It's going to suck for a while, but don't worry. Hang in there, because when you get to Jerusalem, you'll be bruised up a little bit, but the resurrection will be worth it. So, our rabbis had imagination, and they imagined that. And by the way, that's why the tradition, it's not always observed in cemeteries, but the tradition is to bury a Jew with feet towards Jerusalem. Well, yeah.
If your funeral is in a sanctuary, you're taken out feet first.
I can never remember. But yeah, one of those. It's intentional. Carol remembers that when your casket is being conveyed to the grave, it's either head first or feet first, and I can never remember which it is. But it's intentional, and it's from this kind of stuff.
Hey, Jay.
Yes.
Jay, it's Bud. I hate to interrupt you during this, but I
Not at all. Thanks, bud. Go ahead.
I have a quick comment and then I have a question. So first of all, a comment. You were talking about, whether or not you might be able to instruct a doctor, not just to take you off life support, but to actually physically go and kill you and put an end to your life. And I don't know what the religious issue is, but there's in virtually every state, it's a legal issue. Doctors are not going to do it because it's a legal issue that they can't take a life. So there are a couple of states, I think, that you can have euthanasia. The thing that's interesting to me is, we've had to put down several pets over time. There's a much more humane way to do it, it seems to me, for an animal than it is for a human, which is strange.
It's incredible. Yeah, that's absolutely right, bud. I believe the states include Oregon and Vermont.
Yeah.
And by the way, just as a neat little trivia, this is my only claim to fame. I grew up about 3 houses down from Dr. Kevorkian.
Okay,
if that's a thing.
I think it's a legal issue, not a religious issue.
Correct. It is definitely a legal issue. That's right. And you're right as well about the ability to lovingly allow our pets a much more gentle and humane death than we allow our humans.
Which is why I'm building very close relationships with veterinarians. So anyway, here's my question. If you buy the fact that at death, the soul is separated from the body and then it's thrown into this collective, I guess, to be reused somewhere else. My question is, are all the memories of the prior life that it just left taken out? Or is some of that still there moving into the next life? And is that part of the direction?
Yeah. Wow. That's terrific, bud. So what you're asking about is the continuity of sense of self. So it's all well and good if you breathe your last and your energy joins the collective. But as far as your sense of of me, does that continue? And here now we're getting into the realm of people saying, I know that it does. My loved one comes and visits me, or I know that my mother and father have been reunited now, and they're back together the way they should be, or I can go to the wind phone down the hill and I can talk to my loved one. So but I don't know, and
yeah, no, I wasn't expecting an answer, but it's the soul that I was referring to. If you believe in the fact that there is a soul, and that soul goes into the collective to get reused, does that soul carry on any of the memories of any of the prior lives? Maybe there's thousands of prior lives that it's had.
I see. One of you said reincarnation. I misunderstood. That is not so much a Jewish teaching, that that soul gets reused in another body. There is a concept
that it went to the collective in thinking. So what's it do in the collective? It just stays there for eternity?
Correct. It has been there for eternity. It comes to a body and lives in the body for a period of a life, and then it rejoins the collective for the rest of eternity. That's right.
Never to be put into another body.
Well, I mean, the prophecy that we just looked at makes it sound like our soul will be rejoined with our body when the Messiah comes.
Oh, well,
but
okay.
Here's one thing that I do want to say about this, and I know we're getting it's getting a little on the later side. If you go into my study and you look at the books that are all around my walls, and you assume, I think fairly, that the number of books on any topic represents, Jewish attention paid to that. You're going to see a whole wall of history books. You're going to see 2 sections on Shabbat and a whole other area on kashrut, and all the way through all the Jewish things, family purity and marriage and tort law and all this stuff. You're going to find one little book up in the top left corner on the afterlife. It is not something the Jews put very much energy into thinking about, writing about, working towards. And here's a lovely proof text for that. This is one of my favorite texts in all of Jewish tradition. It says, if you are planting a sapling and someone approaches and says, the Messiah has come, you should finish planting the sapling and then go greet the Messiah. And I love the idea that you can get caught up in all of this esoteric stuff that we can't prove either way. We don't know. So let's go with what we know. We know that planting a sapling is important. We know that life before death is important. Living focused on the life after death or the life at death is something that Carolyn asked about and that I hear more interest in. And so I think we'll spend some time exploring that in the third session. What's our relationship to the concept of death? What are the costs and the benefits of maintaining that in our awareness? Barbara? So Barbara is asking about the sense of afterlife taking the form of our reputation, how we are remembered in this world after we're gone. I love that, and I ascribe to that. And there are opinions all over the map. So Carol, I think, and I were talking before everyone gathered about the notion on a tombstone. Often there are letters carved at the top, an acronym that says Tehi Nishmato Tzura B'Tzur HaChaim, which means may his soul be bound up in the bonds of everlasting life. What the hell does that mean? It might mean that he is everlastingly enjoying the fruits of heaven. Or it might mean that his children and those who loved him go on having been affected by him. And his mark on the world is permanent in the sense that they're different because of him and their impact on those after them. So in that way, the value of a good name lives on. And there's lots of texts about that too. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, one more thought on the soul. If the soul now lives forever in this collective up there, the soul of all your ancestors are also living in this collective up there forever. And maybe that's where you see your ancestors again. When you get, maybe the souls can get together up there. If you buy into that, maybe that's the case.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly right, Bud. And that is exactly the way I know a lot of people experience their relationship to death. It takes some of the sting out of the loss. And there's nothing wrong with that tension in your head of knowing that this might be a fabrication and not caring, needing it to be comforting. I like it, and I gave you permission. Okay, whew. Covered a lot of ground. I am going to. I like at the end of classes like this to send out a summary and resources and the recording. But Mark and I are climbing on an airplane tomorrow morning on the early side. And so, well, you don't say climbing on an airplane? The car is picking us up at your place at 6:45. That's on the early side. I don't want to be up that early anyway. All right, Mark is going to. So Mark is going to be sending out a summary of the class and some resources, and he'll have the recording up online. Anyway, I may not get to it until we're back from Nepal, but I'm looking forward to coming back and rejiggering my third session. The second session, I think, can stand as it is. Carolyn? Yeah, sure. Sure. Yep. The next session is February 29th, and the final session is March 7th.
Have a good trip.
Thank you, Marty. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, everyone. I
way,
appreciated your partnership.
Jay, you're going to be
Thank
traveling
you.
in an airplane tomorrow, not on an airplane, I assume.
Yeah, I know. That's what I thought I was going to get the hard time about. Thank you, Bud. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Bon voyage.
Safe trip.
Good night, everyone.
Bon voyage. Bye, everyone.